First, I recommend if you have the time and the space to conduct a collection assessment and evaluate what digital collections you already have. For some of you, you may not have any, so you're starting from zero, and that's fine. Others, you may have inherited, digital projects done before you, or maybe you've done a few on your already yourself, but you're not sure where to go next. And particularly when we're in a time where we're thinking about trying to make our collection holdings more inclusive in the stories that they tell and offering more representation of what our collections are and online, as well as physically in exhibits, it's really important to be purposefully evaluative of what's been done and have that help inform what you're doing next. And some guided questions to think about when you're in this part of the process is the quality of the digital files that you have currently acceptable? For many of us who inherit a digital collection, they could have been scanned 10 plus years ago and maybe at like 100 DPI instead of 600 DPI, things like that. So it may be worth reevaluating and reinvesting in digitizing those at better quality and at better standards. Another question to think about is the catalog information correct, and does it meet best practices? So if you've digitized items in your collection and you've cataloged and put them online, do those meet best practices, both in terms of whether it's Society of American Archivists or ICOM best practices, or even internal practices. But for many of us, if we're inheriting something from earlier, it usually doesn't always meet our current standards. Then think about, does the current collection management system content provide a representative sample across all collection areas? For many of us, especially if we're working with grant-funded projects, it's sort of piecemeal in terms of what collections get more or less representation. So where are there collection areas that maybe haven't received that attention, and address those? And then, of course, are there any other descriptive or access points of improvement you can make, whether that is the content itself or the way you're delivering, managing, storing it, etc.? So once you've done that assessment process, you will probably come up with more than one project idea. And so the next part is prioritizing, because many of us don't have unlimited resources and staff to do these things. And so we really need to think about how to choose what happens next. So the guided questions I have here are: which items are completely hidden? So thinking about those collection areas that maybe haven't been digitized yet and not online or anywhere that could be accessed, how can you put a representative sampling of images online for them? Which items are in danger of disappearing? And disappearing is sort of a non-alarmist word for which ones are deteriorating at a very scary rate, or may not be able to be digitized for much longer. So I'm thinking of negatives, where the emulsion on the negative is deteriorating at such a rate you're not going to be able to scan it again. So thinking about those things in terms of urgency, what are items that are at most risk? Another way to look at this is which items are more frequently used. For us, especially when we're the caretakers of collections, we want to try and minimize as much harm as possible to our collection. And one of those ways is to think about the items that get pulled out the most, whether that's pulled out for display, reference, etc. Which items could really benefit from having a digital representative available for some of those events. The next item to think about is getting into that diversity and representation mindset, and that's thinking about which items can provide increased representation. So whether that's increased representation of the community around you, increased representation to help balance out what sort of collections and communities you have represented in your exhibit, those kinds of things. And then, of course, which items can support current projects or museum efforts. So, maybe your museum is hitting a centennial of some event, and so it makes sense to be proactive and digitize things that will likely be requested for those events, press release, etc. Or perhaps the museum just went through some new strategic planning, and so you've adjusted your mission, and now there are projects that make sense to help support whatever that new strategic plan is. Now, thinking about project construction, and I know all of us are subject matter experts versus project managers, but if ever you have a chance to take a project management class, I highly recommend it. And so here's just like a outline of thinking about creating your project with some project management principles in mind. So the very first thing I recommend you do is once you've gone through that assessment and prioritization of the projects, for those that are at the top, articulate what your need is. For many of us as collection managers, we know that these things are important and we assume that everybody else also knows that these items are important and that it's important to digitize. But we actually need to make sure that we are articulating that need and being very clear with everyone, especially resource allocators, as to why we need to do this digitization project. And then, of course, the next thing that you're going to need to figure out is what are the outcomes. And so for outcomes, for us, we'll immediately think of, okay, well, I've digitized 100 items and I've put them online. That's the outcome, which is a good one. It's more a product deliverable, though, and I want to challenge you all to think about outcomes as something more intangible and think about some of those questions I asked you earlier. Will this project help you build better representation in your collections? Will this project help preserve the items because you've digitized them and removed them from frequent use? Those are outcomes, and those are what are really going to speak to grant acquisition, grant reviewers, your executive director, donors and funders, etc. Next, you're going to have to determine resources. So depending on the scope of your project, you'll have to figure out, do you have the equipment necessary or the software? Do you need to bring someone in to help you do it? Those types of questions, and really articulating what sort of resources you need, because you will likely need to go and either ask a donor or a granting agency, et cetera, to get that money. And then the next part, I want you to think about what sort of level of descriptive standards you want to use. So what fields will you use when you catalog these items? What thesauri are you going to use? That type of thing. Because if you are writing a grant, you are definitely going to need to include that. And even if you're not, that's something to identify ahead of time before you begin the project. And then, of course, construct that digitization equation. And I know this is something we've chatted about before, and I'll drop a link resource for you coming up. But think about the time it's going to take either you or a vendor or a student employee, whoever is going to do the digitization and cataloging work. You will need to craft an equation that will outline how long will it take me to prepare this object. So whether that's removing it from storage and putting it on the scanner, or removing it and sending it to a vendor, maybe it has to get some conservation. What does that look like? And then, of course, the digitization itself, whether you are using an Epson scanner at the office or you're working with a vendor, get some of those digitization timeframes in place, especially dependent on what types of items you are digitizing. That will also impact how long it takes. Then, of course, you're going to need to think about file management, the resource or research you need to do to learn about that object so that you can then catalog and write that descriptive data, and then the reviewing and the publishing to whatever platform you use. So with all of that in mind, calculating the time it will take you, your staff, working with a vendor, and bringing out that whole timeline from starting to ending.